Here's something no one says out loud. The loneliest person in every manhwa is the strongest one. Not the villain. Not the side character who never gets a power-up. The hero. The one who wins every fight, clears every dungeon, rewrites every rule of the universe. That guy is sitting alone in a room eating convenience store ramen, while the people who love him watch from a distance they didn't choose. And we just accept that. We call it cool. We call it the price of power. We make AMVs about it set to funk music, and we never once ask, why does this keep happening? Because it isn't an accident. It isn't lazy writing. It is the entire point. And once you see what's actually being said about Korea, about masculinity, about what it costs to survive in a country that runs on pressure, you cannot unsee it. The thesis. The standard reading of manhwa isolation goes like this. The hero gets stronger, he outpaces his peers, and loneliness is just the math. Power divides. Simple. That reading is wrong. Isolation in manhwa isn't a side effect of the story. It's the architecture. It's built into the grammar of these narratives at a structural level, in the way systems are designed, in the way other characters are written to fall behind, in the way emotional vulnerability is framed as either weakness or a liability that gets people killed. The manhwa hero doesn't end up alone because he became too powerful. He ends up alone because the story was always teaching him that connection is a cost he can't afford. That's a very specific thing to keep telling young men, and Korea has been telling them that story, not just in manhwa, but in its schools, its workplaces, its military, for generations. So let's go deeper. Let's start with the mechanics. Section 1. Why power creates distance. You can't understand what I've been through. Every manhwa hero says this at some point, sometimes with words, usually with silence. And the reader nods because we've watched them go through it. We've seen the raids, the gates, the monarchs, the regression loops. Of course, no one understands. We were there. But notice what that does narratively. It makes the reader the hero's only true companion. Everyone inside the story gets left behind. Only we follow him all the way. Sung Jin-Woo in Solo Leveling is the cleanest example. His entire power system is called the Solo Leveling System. The name isn't metaphor, it's instruction. From the moment that Double Dungeon breaks him and remakes him, he is given a framework for existing that is fundamentally incompatible with partnership. He gets stronger in isolation. He hunts alone. His shadow soldiers are loyal, but they are not peers. They cannot challenge him, question him, or grow beyond him. He has built himself an army of mirrors. And what happens when he reaches the top? When he becomes the strongest human being to ever exist? He doesn't finally find his people. He finds out he was always supposed to be alone, because the entire reason for his power was a war no other human could participate in. His ascent was, from the beginning, a preparation for solitude at cosmic scale. The manhwa doesn't frame this as tragedy. It frames it as destiny. That distinction matters enormously. Now look at Kim Dokja in Omniscient Reader's viewpoint. Here the isolation is even more honest, because it's established before the apocalypse even starts. Kim Dokja has spent years reading a single web novel, a story no one else reads, by an author no one else follows. He is the only reader. And when that story becomes reality, when the scenarios begin and people are dying in ways he already knows about, what does he have? He has knowledge. He has the map. And the map is a wall. He cannot share what he knows without sounding insane. He cannot be fully honest about how he knows things without becoming a target. His greatest asset, complete narrative foreknowledge, is the thing that makes genuine intimacy structurally impossible. He is surrounded by people who need him, people who even love him, and he can never let them see the whole of who he is. That's not a power fantasy. That's a parable about what it's like to carry information no one around you can receive. And then there's Jin Mori in God of High School. His isolation is different. It's not melancholy, it's oblivious. He loves fighting, he loves his friends. He seems like the opposite of our lonely hero thesis. But watch what happens when his true nature is revealed. When the divine power emerges and the stakes transcend a high school tournament, the story essentially removes him from the social plane. His friends become witnesses to a mythology they weren't born into. Daiwai and Mira are remarkable humans. Jin Mori is a god. The show treats this gap with warmth, but it cannot close it. The friendship survives. The equality doesn't. Across all three of these stories, you see the same structure. A mechanism that ensures the hero can only travel so far with other people before the road stops accommodating company. That mechanism isn't narrative convenience, it's a worldview. Here's the question that should be bothering you right now. Why does Korean popular fiction keep building this trap? Because it isn't just manhwa, it's K-dramas, it's Korean cinema. The isolated protagonist who achieves everything and holds everyone at a precise, controlled distance is the recurring figure of modern Korean storytelling. That's not a genre preference, that's a cultural confession. Section 2. The psychology, shame, hyperindependence, and Korean male identity. To understand why manhwa heroes are alone, you have to understand what Korean masculinity is being asked to perform. Korea has one of the highest rates of work-related death from overwork, Gwarosa, in the developed world. It has among the highest rates of competitive academic pressure, measured by hours of study, hours of private tutoring, and the weight placed on a single exam, the suneung, that functionally determines your social trajectory for life. And it has, running beneath all of this, a cultural concept that has no clean English translation, Nunchi. Nunchi is the ability to read a room, to feel what others feel before they say it, to know what is expected of you and adjust accordingly without being told, without fuss. It is considered a foundational social skill in Korea, and on its surface it sounds like empathy. But Nunchi has a shadow. When you spend your life reading the room, you also learn to hide yourself within it. You learn that presenting need, real need, emotional need, disrupts the room. It makes others uncomfortable. It is a burden. And in a culture where being a burden carries genuine shame, vulnerability becomes something you manage privately. Now put that psychology inside a man who is already exceptional. The manhwa hero is always, at his origin, someone who was not exceptional. Sung Jin-Woo was the weakest hunter in Korea. Kim Dokja was a salaryman with no social life. Yeon-woo in Tomb of the Stars, Monarchs of the Sky, hardcore leveling adjacent narratives, all of these men begin in positions of failure or invisibility. And failure, in Korea's achievement culture, carries moral weight. It is not just a setback, it is a reflection of character, of worth. So, when the power comes, there is something underneath the cool exterior that these stories almost never say explicitly, but always show: relief. The power means he is no longer a burden, no longer a disappointment, no longer the person in the room who makes everyone else uncomfortable by existing at the wrong level. And here is where hyperindependence is born. Hyperindependence isn't confidence. Psychologists are increasingly clear on this. Hyperindependence is a trauma response, specifically the response of someone who learned at a formative level that depending on others is dangerous, that people leave or fail you, or that your needs will be met with contempt rather than care. So you stop having needs, or more precisely, you stop showing them. Look at how manhwa heroes treat help. Really look at it. They accept tactical assistance, they accept information. But emotional support, comfort, being held when something breaks them? Almost never. And when it happens, it's written as a moment of profound exception. The single scene in 40 chapters where the armor comes off, framed with so much gravity, that it communicates exactly how aberrant this is. How costly. Tower of God makes this literal. Bam. 25th. Bam begins the story by climbing a tower to find the one person who ever made him feel like he mattered. Rachel. That's the entire engine of his early arc. He is so starved for connection that he will ascend an infinite vertical structure populated by killers just to find the girl who was kind to him. And then Rachel pushes him off a ledge. And then Bam keeps climbing. The lesson the narrative delivers, whether intentionally or not, is brutal. The person you trusted most will hurt you, and the correct response is to become too powerful to be hurt again. To build yourself into something that cannot be pushed off ledges. Not because the wound heals, but because the wound calcifies into strength. That is not a healthy relationship to trauma, but it is a recognizable one, especially in a country where mental health stigma remains high, where therapy carries shame, and where the prescribed masculine response to pain has historically been endure and advance. The Manhwa hero isn't a power fantasy about being strong. He is a coping mechanism in narrative form. He is the version of yourself that never has to need anyone again. And the story calls that freedom. Millions of young Korean men read these stories. Millions more across Asia, the West, everywhere Manhwa has reached. And the demographic skews heavily toward men in their late teens and 20s, the precise group most at risk of the kind of social isolation that, in Korea, contributes to some of the starkest loneliness statistics in the OECD. Ask yourself, are these stories a mirror or are they a manual? Because there's a difference between a story that reflects loneliness with enough honesty that you feel seen, and a story that teaches you to valorize it. Section 3. What the author is really saying about modern Korea. Korea went from one of the poorest nations on Earth in the 1950s to a top 15 global economy in roughly 40 years. That's not just economic growth. That's a civilizational sprint. And sprints leave things behind. What got left behind in Korea's economic miracle, the miracle on the Han River as they call it, was time. Time to process. Time to build the kind of social infrastructure, community, mental health care, intergenerational trust, that slower developing societies take for granted. Korean society optimized for output, for productivity, for the kind of individual achievement that could be exported, measured, and ranked. The result is a country that by almost every material metric is extraordinary, and that by almost every social metric is paying for it. Record low birth rates, epidemic loneliness among young men. A word, sampo generation, coined by Koreans themselves to describe the generation that gave up on dating, marriage, and children because the cost of building a life felt too high. The Manhwa hero lives in that world, not always explicitly but atmospherically, structurally. When Return of the Blade Master or The Beginning After the End put their heroes through regression, sending them back to the start, armed with memories of everything they've already lived through. What is that really? It's a fantasy of second chances in a system that gives you almost none. Korea's academic pipeline doesn't offer second chances gracefully. The suneung happens once a year. Your early career trajectory, your university, your company. These things have gravity that is very difficult to escape. Regression narratives are wish fulfillment for people who felt the window close. And the hero in these stories almost always makes the same choices the second time, but better, more efficient, more powerful, less vulnerable to the mistakes that came from trusting the wrong people. He goes through the same life alone and wins. Consider what Eleceed or the S classes that I raised do differently, and it's worth noting these exceptions. They allow genuine warmth, genuine found family. And it's not a coincidence that these are among the Manhwa most beloved specifically for their emotional texture. Readers notice the warmth because it's rare. It lands hard because the genre's default is cold. The default is a man at a summit with no one beside him, and the authors, many of them young Korean men themselves, are not writing this because they think it's ideal. They are writing it because it is felt, because something about that image resonates at a frequency that data can't fully capture, but that lived experience immediately recognizes. The lone hero at the top of the world is, in some profound and painful way, the image that modern Korean achievement culture holds up as its end state. You grind, you sacrifice, you outpace everyone around you, and then you stand there, and the people you left behind can't follow, and the ones who tried to climb with you got dropped somewhere along the way. And the Manhwa calls that the ending. Not always with grief, sometimes with triumph. Sometimes the final panel is the hero looking out over a transformed world with the hint of peace in his expression. But he is alone in that panel. Almost always. That's not an oversight. That's the thesis. But here's where it gets complicated. Here's where these stories become something more than genre fiction. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the manhwa breaks its own rules. Sung Jin-Woo, at the end, chooses to remake the world so that the people he loves can exist in it. Kim Dokja spends the entire runtime of Omniscient Reader dismantling his own hyperindependence, slowly and painfully, one act of trust at a time. Even Bam, after everything Rachel costs him, doesn't become closed. He becomes careful. He remains capable of love. These cracks matter. They're the authors reaching past the genre convention and towards something true. Let's go back to where we started. The loneliest person in every manhwa is the strongest one. We've been reading that as a law of the genre, but I want you to consider reading it as a diagnosis. Because the manhwa hero doesn't end up alone because power is isolating in some abstract universal sense. He ends up alone because he was built by his culture, by his story, by the architecture of his world, to believe that accepting help is weakness, to believe that love is a vector for pain, to believe that the summit, the achievement, the ranking, the absolute peak of what a human being can become is worth any human cost. And here's the uncomfortable thing. That belief is not unique to fiction. The manhwa is popular because the manhwa is honest. Not aspirational, honest. It is telling young men who feel invisible, who feel like the weakest person in the dungeon, who feel like the world runs on systems they didn't design and can't change. Here is a fantasy where you win. And in that fantasy, winning looks exactly like what you've been trained to believe winning looks like. Solitary, self-made, needing no one. That fantasy is seductive. And it is also, if you follow it all the way to its logical conclusion, a portrait of loss. What does it mean that the most beloved manhwa protagonists are almost always alone at the apex? What does it mean that readers identify with that aloneness, not as a flaw to be grieved, but as a feature to be admired? It means that somewhere between the pressure of the suneung and the isolation of the one-room apartment, between the silence of the workplace and the shame of falling short, something got decided, something got accepted. That love is a luxury, that connection is a risk, that the strongest version of you is the one who needs the least. Manhwa didn't invent that idea, but it has given it a mythology. It has given it shadow armies and system windows and S-rank status and the most beautiful, clean, devastating art style in modern comics. It has made the lonely man at the top look inevitable. And maybe, the reason millions of people keep reading is not just to see him win. Maybe it's to watch for the moment he doesn't have to do it alone anymore. Maybe that's what we're actually waiting for. Every chapter, every arc, every regression and return. Not the power. The moment the power turns around and there's someone still standing there.